Seeking answers, many media types have looked back to October 1991, when the Senate voted to confirm Justice Clarence Thomas to the U.S. Supreme Court, after an all-male Senate Judiciary Committee had outraged millions of women by hurling dismissive, even hostile questions at a former subordinate, attorney Anita Hill, who testified that he had sexually harassed her. Almost exactly 1 year later, on November 3, 1992, the American people elected more new Congresswomen, 24, and more new female senators, 4, than in any other single election in history, nearly doubling the number of women in the House and tripling their ranks in the Senate. That year also saw record numbers of women run for office, win their party's nominations, and turn out to vote. It came to be known as the Year of the Woman, and widespread backlash to the Thomas Hill controversy was viewed as the main reason why. Trump has already been serving the same function in this election cycle. And he's been generating more backlash among women than Thomas or his Republican defenders ever did. The numbers tell the tale. More than 3 million Americans participated in women's marches on Inauguration Day in 2017, more than 1 million marched 1 year later. That's a remarkable surge in activism, and it's been mirrored by a similar surge in candidate recruitment. In 2018, 53 women sought nominations for the Senate, 476 for the House, and 61 for governor, according to the Rutgers University Center for American Women and Politics. Each total broke a previous record. And so did the number of women primary victors who are going on to the general election, 22 in the Senate, 235 in the House, and 16 for governor. It's worth noting that most of these candidates and nominees have not been Republicans. Of the 235 women running for Congress, 183 are Democrats. That compares to 120 women on the Democratic line in 2016, the previous record, and 52 women running as Republicans this year. 15 of the 22 female Senate candidates are Democrats, and 12 of the 16 gubernatorial picks. As it turns out, the nomination and election of a man accused of sexual assault and harassment by at least 19 women, a man who once boasted of grabbing women by their genitals and who has continued while president to refer to members of the opposite sex as dogs, might have been the decisive factor in ushering in a second year of the woman. And it's too late for Republicans to undo that. The third is just one of many competitive races in Minnesota, as Democrats also attempt to flip the neighboring 2nd District, where Democrat Angie Craig is polling slightly ahead of Representative Jason Lewis in a rematch of their 2016 race that Cook Political Report also recently moved to a lean Democrat rating. Democrats are defending open seats in the 1st, along the southern border, and 8th, the northeast of the state along Lake Michigan, with both races currently pegged as toss-ups. The flurry of tight House contests is in addition to a gubernatorial race. The incumbent Democrat, Mark Dayton, isn't running for re-election, and the special election to fill former Senator Al Franken's seat. Christopher Wilson. But in the wake of a recent Quinnipiac poll showing that Latino voters are less inclined than African Americans, millennials, women or Democrats more broadly to see Trump as unfit for office, some experts are questioning whether this notoriously low turnout bloc will actually show up on Election Day and help deliver Congress to Nancy Pelosi and co. The answer could ultimately make the difference between a blue wave or a blue ripple. The Texas Senate contest is a key race to watch. Democratic Representative Beto O'Rourke of El Paso has been running a surprisingly strong campaign against Republican incumbent Ted Cruz. But even though he speaks fluent Spanish and represents a heavily Latino district, O'Rourke has so far been underperforming among Latino voters. In the March Democratic primary, for instance, he won less than 2/3 of the statewide vote and lost several key border counties with large Hispanic populations to Houston activist Sima Hernandez. Meanwhile, since 2016, there's been no surge of new Latino voters in Texas's urban counties or in the heavily Latino counties of the Rio Grande Valley, according to voter registration data. In November, O'Rourke's fate might come down to which reading of the mood among Latino voters is more accurate and whether he can convince them to act. And given how many seats Democrats are targeting in heavily Latino areas, from Texas to Arizona to California, he's hardly alone. Control of Congress could hang in the balance. Bannon is back. The new film Trump at War is Steve Bannon's latest effort to keep Trump in the Oval Office and himself at the volcanic core of national affairs, reports Newspulse News national correspondent Alexander Nassarian. This is not a persuasion election, Bannon says. This is all about getting your base out. To that end, he says he now runs a very sophisticated war room whose planning sessions include some 24 individuals. Among them is Sam Nunberg, the early Trump aide who supposedly came up with the border wall idea, and Patrick Cadell, President Jimmy Carter's one-time pollster. We run the only war room that's out there backing the Trump agenda, Bannon says. The claim is difficult to confirm, given the number of pro-Trump groups of varying size outside the White House. For all its high production values, Trump at War is an unmistakable sign of anxiety over a base that has begun to show signs of Trump fatigue. Bannon wants them totally jacked up, ready to vote as well as actively campaign in their communities for Republican candidates. Trump has mocked the notion of a Democratic landslide, predicting a red wave instead. Bannon, though, is remarkably frank about the lack of enthusiasm among conservatives. And he is just as open about his envy of progressives, who are organized and energized. They do understand the stakes, he says of his enemies. They understand that Trump is in their personal life 20 or 30 years from now unless they stop this program. They've gotta stop Trump in November. You don't need to tell the left the stakes, you don't need to tell them the urgency. They're woke. Alexander Nassarian, how climate change could swing key House races. Voters, especially those in coastal communities at risk from rising sea levels, are starting to take climate change more seriously, reports Newspulse News' Michael Walsh. Even some Republican voters. The Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, for instance, recently found that concern about man-made climate change has increased among moderate Republicans by 15 percentage points since May 2017 and among conservative Republicans 7 points since October 2017. Environmental groups like the League of Conservation Voters, LCV, and the Environmental Defense Action Fund are promoting surveys that suggest that candidates can swing competitive races by publicly denouncing the Trump administration's attacks on environmental regulations. According to a recent poll by the Global Strategy Group, this messaging could shift vote choice by 11% in the environmentalist candidates' favor in 20 battleground House districts. Just look at Florida, where toxic algae has become a top election issue. Or California, where anti-environment members of Congress like Mimi Walters, who has voted against nearly every attempt to address the climate crisis, suddenly signed a letter calling for climate action as the state faces devastating wildfires. Pete Maysmith, LCV's senior vice president for campaigns, told Newspulse News. Climate is clearly on the ballot, and Republican leadership's many environmental attacks could ultimately cost them control of the House. Donna Shalala, who served as Secretary of Health and Human Services under President Bill Clinton, is the Democratic nominee in a tight race for Florida's 27th congressional district, which includes a large portion of Miami. South Florida is ground zero for sea level rise and continues to be at risk with the effects of climate change. We are uniquely positioned between two national parks, Everglades and Biscayne, both of which feel the effects of climate change every day, Shalala told Newspulse News. Without question, it will be a critical issue for voters in Florida, 27, because the voters want to send someone to Washington who will get something done to protect our environment and combat climate change. Michael Walsh.